In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
They shall look on him whom they have pierced. But with what vision will they see him? How will they understand? Last night at the Last Supper, Jesus worked to prepare his friends, prepare us to understand something of what he was doing for us, what would overtake him and what its meaning would be. And he recalled for them the great tenderness with which he had been with them all the time they had been together, stooping to wash their feet as any servant would do, to care for them. And I suggested it would be helpful to ask God the Holy Spirit to bring to our own minds the times in which Christ has cared for us, the times when the Lord has been with us, and perhaps we haven't noticed it. Perhaps there is a time from your own childhood that the Spirit would bring to your mind, just to refresh in you the sense of how much he has always loved you. And now, having prepared us, he goes about this great action and make certain that Jesus is no mere victim, though those who pierce him may only see him as such. We must ask, as surely Mary and the beloved disciple who risked everything to be so near to him asked for God to give us the vision, to show us the deeper meaning of what he undergoes, having loved his own who are in the world. He loves them to the end. Jesus' death, viewed from within the world of his day as from our world, alas, is tinged with the darkness of the omnipresence of such violence and death. The scholars who study Jesus' period tell us that of babies that are born, live births, fully 30% would have died in infancy, and of those, 60% would have been gone by their teenage years. And for those who survived, over 70% of those young men and women would have already lost one or both of their parents. They lived in a world dominated by death, famine, disease. The Romans, who would use crucifixion as a tool to dominate and terrorize subject populations all over the ancient Mediterranean world, stringing up live human beings on wooden beams, dozens and dozens upon them across hillsides, attempting to terrify people into submission. And in a world like that, a world so powerfully afflicted by violence and death, it would have been very hard for people to make sense of how God could be at work in things. There would have been a terrible temptation to see God as somehow needing to be on the side of some kind of ultimate order, some kind of ultimate justice, to make some kind of sense of things. And so the religious authorities, confronted by this man who went out of his way to welcome outsiders and people who were not like them, who perhaps didn't follow the rules terribly well, they couldn't help but see him whom they had pierced as a dangerous man who would have brought about violence upon their own people, whom they needed to protect by handing him over to a violence that they could summon from the occupying colonial power. He was dangerous, they would have said, telling themselves and anyone who would listen, he transgressed the boundaries we have from God that keep us safe from sin. He is always letting unclean people near him. His reckless giving and extravagant acts, these feedings, these healings, these forgivings, these raisings from the dead, apparently, all give people false hope. He must be made quiet so that people will learn the right way to come to God. It's very simple. When we are good, then God will love us. And when we are bad, God punishes us. That is the order of things. And so when you see someone who is successful and doing well in life, he must be a wonderful person whom God is blessing. And when you see someone who is suffering and afflicted, clearly they've done something to deserve it, and God is punishing them. Jesus, they would have said, looking at him whom they had pierced, Jesus makes people think too much about God anyway. They probably should be thinking much more about their own sinfulness, about how much harder they should try to live up to the law, to be good. He seduces them into hoping for something from God which they could not possibly have deserved. He says he is God's own beloved child. Well, we will show that God hates sin, God punishes injustice, God's anger will destroy those who are unworthy to call God their Father. Look how he is condemned. The one who hangs on the cross is accursed by God. The scriptures tell us that. Look how the Romans torture him. This must be what he deserved. His suffering must be God's punishment for his blasphemy. Alas, as many of us know from other times perhaps in our lives or other places in the church, this mind, this way of looking upon him whom we have pierced, can persist through many centuries, even within the church. It can sound very much the same. It can even distort our reading of a passage like the first one we heard tonight from Isaiah, a reading in which God seems to be punishing Jesus instead of us. God's anger, God's hatred of sin falls on Christ in our place. Because Jesus was really innocent and we are the guilty, it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. In fact, God, says this religious point of view, God has given Christ to be our sacrifice for sin, so that now at last someone will suffer enough to make up for all our evil, so that now at last God's anger will be appeased and God will forgive us. This is what Thomas Merton called the moral theology of the devil. And the great English Dominican thinker Herbert McCabe commented upon this point of view. It is very odd, he wrote, it is very odd that people should think that when we do good, God will reward us, and when we do evil, God will punish us. I mean, it is very odd that Christians should think this, that God deals out what we deserve. I suppose it is the commonest way of thinking about God, but you could say that the main theme of the preaching of Jesus is that God is not like that at all. Sin is something that changes God into a projection of our own guilt, so that we don't see the real God at all. We see some kind of judge. The whole meaning of God, the whole meaning and point and purpose of our lives, writes McCabe, has become a condemnation of us. Sin turns our experience of God into something like a kind of punitive God, a satanic God, the accuser of humankind. It is very odd that so much casual Christian thinking should be a worship of Satan. That we should think of this punitive satanic God as the only God available to us sinners. It is very odd, adds McCabe, that the view of God as seen from the church should sometimes ever be simply the view of God as seen from hell. For damnation must be just being fixed in this illusion, stuck forever with the God who punishes, stuck forever with the God provided by our sin. For sin doesn't alter God's attitude to us in the least. God is simply eternal love. But sin does alter our attitude to God, so that we change him from the God who is simply love into the punitive, satanic God. Jesus' death, as viewed through the eyes of those whose minds and culture are soaked in death, for whom in fear violence seems to be only held at bay with yet more violence. This is a view which has afflicted even the very heart of our own Christian faith for many centuries. And yet Jesus had said, "I come that you have life, and have it abundantly." So what would it be like to look on him whom we have pierced, through the eyes of those who hunger not for a more powerful violence to push away what frightens us, not for a power that will push death a tiny bit further off, but for those who hunger for life, life imperishable, life unquenchable. Think about Jesus' death viewed through the eyes of such life. Imagine that you are the family of one of the little children or young people killed recently in Florida. Perhaps you're the family of Luke Hoyer, or maybe the family of Rachel Scott killed at Columbine, or Emily Parker, one of the 19 children killed at Sandy Hook. Grief and numbness beset you, trying to make some fragile, heartbroken sense of this violence. And then Luke or Emily or Rachel is with you, more alive than ever. She takes you by the hand and leads you to see all that has gone on in her life with you, the immense beauty and deep significance of every little thing. The day she first smiled when she was a tiny baby, the day she brought home a poem for you from 3rd grade, the day the cat died and she comforted you. And think of Luke there with you, the very meaning and truth of all that he has ever been, like a light that flows through his life with you, now letting you see the real meaning of all that he had done and all you had shared together. Yes, but you cry out, it's all lost, it's all destroyed. Luke, Emily, Rachel, all the other hundreds of children who die by violence every day. And yet, they hold your hand more tightly. Well, I did die, he says, but I'm alive. God gives me his life straight from him now. It no longer has to come through my own mortal body. All the moments of my life, all that I am, God accepts and loves. And that's why I'm alive, because God is life itself. And in him there is no darkness at all. And he gives me life now that's bigger and more real than death. As Christians, we believe that that has already begun, that life with Jesus pouring into our death-bound world, and that it will happen for Luke and Emily and Rachel and all God's children. We call this life resurrection because in our world it is the overcoming of death. But really it is just God's life, the creative force that summons the universe into being. Do you think a little death can stand in the way of that? Galaxies, planets, stars, every blade of grass held continually in existence by the song of the great singer of life, Almighty and everlasting God. That is the life that we meet in the risen Christ. The resurrection of Christ is the future of the universe, breaking into our present world through a tomb. This way of seeing the cross of Jesus and what it means is only possible because of his being alive to teach us now and to work his new life within our minds and hearts. So it was for Jesus' first disciples, and so it can and must be for us now if we ask. Jesus, crucified and yet alive, came to take his friends by the hand, just as now at this very time, in this very liturgy, if you wish, he may come by the power of the Spirit and lead us into the very heart and meaning of all that he does, of all that he suffers, in order to go on loving where we would turn away from loving. In the living light, he who is the light and truth itself shows us the immense and eternal depths of meaning that embrace every moment of his earthly life, including every moment of his life in your life, of the moments that you have forgotten when he has been with you. Well, I did die, he says, but I'm alive. It's true I died because of sin, not because the Father needed to punish someone in order to be willing to forgive, but because the world of sin and its fear and anger rejected me. But don't you see, I make of this sin even, I make of this cross another way, a more consummate way to give myself in yet more love to you and to the one who sent me to you, the one who has always loved me. And that's all, says Jesus, our Father has ever wanted. That's why he created us, to love us into loving him, to love us into life so that we could know that life of loving, of giving and being given, of life who is self-sharing love, the life we call God the Trinity, who exists by giving self away to the other, inexhaustibly giving life. To understand something of the cross of Good Friday, we must all come tomorrow night to the vigil, to the great Easter vigil, and pray for the Spirit to descend upon us with that new fire that prefigures both creation and Pentecost. Then we will begin to see, as our forebears did, that in his passion Jesus embraced into the eternal love of the Father, reached through all our sin, all the world's anger and mendacity, fear and hypocrisy, bitterness and violence. He reached through all that, reached past all the terrible and vengeful gods our sin ceaselessly tries to placate and serve. He reached through all that to the one whom he believed had always and would always and does always love him. And he used the cross itself as a way to give himself utterly and completely to us and to this one he calls Abba. And in that perfect offering of us all to the Father in love, he consummates and completes what it is to be human. He completes what it is to be a human being, to love unhindered by fear. And in that very moment, the Father caught Christ up, and we in him, into the very heart of God, into the fullness and truth of all that Jesus was and is, the eternal beloved, the child of God, and each one of us, as God has eternally known and loved us and longed for us to become. Christ, overcoming the power of death to terrify and dominate and distort the lives of the children of God, not by using the weapons of the world, more violence against the world, but by his undaunted love to show us on the cross, in the one whom we have pierced, the Creator's infinitely giving life. Amen.